Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. A museum visitor recently asked me what Poe would have thought of the internet. I think he would have loved it. In his own day, he embraced all the latest technology. In his day, the latest technology meant improved printing presses, which allowed magazines to reach unheard of circulations. And for the first time, a really mass audience. And Poe wrote the kind of works that appealed to that mass audience. He knew what it wanted, and he knew how to use that to improve his writing. So I think he would have used the internet to reach an even greater audience, unimaginable in his day. I also think that Edgar Allan Poe would have loved the internet because it's full of funny cat videos. That's right, Edgar Allan Poe loved pets, especially cats. So we're going to look at a few of the pets Poe owned and one that he decided he couldn't keep on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Throughout his life, Edgar Allan Poe lived with and loved pets. When he was 6 years old, he and his foster parents went abroad, and a friend of the family soon wrote to Mr. Allan, his foster father, to let Edgar know that Tib, his pet cat, was doing okay, and also the dog and the bird. Poe grew up with a parrot that knew how to speak the alphabet in French. Later in life, Poe owned a black cat. We don't know the name of this one, but he wrote about it in 1840 in Alexander's Weekly Messenger, an article called Instinct versus Reason, a Black Cat. This is how he described it. He said, "The writer of this article is the owner of one of the most remarkable black cats in the world." And this is saying much, for it will be remembered that black cats are all of them witches. The one in question has not a white hair about her, and it is a demure and sanctified demeanor. And this particular cat, Poe is just amazed that it can open a door. See, what it does is it jumps up and pulls down the latch with its front paws, and then with its hind legs, it kicks off the door frame, opening the door. And Poe is so amazed by this because he realized this isn't something it knew by instinct. It had to learn it through trial and error. So Poe is impressed by the intelligence of his furry little feline friend. We don't know exactly what happened to this black cat, but 4 years later, he writes in a letter about the cat we all know, Cat Arena. Now, he's been living in Philadelphia, and he and Virginia, who he called Sissy, have traveled up to New York to look for a place to live up there. And he wrote back about what great food they're eating, and he says that, "I wish Katerina could see it. She would faint." And then later in the letter, he says, "Sissy had a hearty cry last night because you and Katerina weren't here." So it sounds like he's pretty attached to little Katerina. And she's described as a big, old, gentle tortoiseshell cat. And they did end up taking the cat with them up to New York City and then to the Bronx. And while they lived there, people described Katerina as sitting on his shoulder while he wrote. So imagine while Poe's writing The Cask of Amontillado or Hop Frog, that classic tale of revenge, Katerina's sitting up there on his shoulder. When his wife got sick, she was bedridden for days and weeks and months on end, and Katerina used to sit and sleep on her chest to keep her warm at night. Poe is so attached to Katerina, and she so attached to him, that a few years later, when Poe died, and his mother-in-law, still living in the Bronx, got the news, she found out that Katerina had died at the same time. Among Poe's other pets he had up there were songbirds. Usually they were wild songbirds that he was able to catch and keep to entertain Sissy. One pet he didn't have was a raven. In fact, he had to explain to some visitors, even apologize for not having a pet raven like they expected to see. After all, Dickens had a raven. Even some of Poe's friends back in Philadelphia had pet ravens. So you think that Poe would have had one, but he didn't. But there's an even more exotic, unusual pet that he was offered and had to turn down. And the fellow who offered it was Hiram Haynes, who was a magazine editor down in Petersburg, Virginia, about half an hour's drive south of Richmond. And from our collection, this is one of two surviving letters that Poe wrote to Hiram Haynes. They're both in the Poe Museum's collection. This one's from 1836 while Poe's working the Southern Literary Messenger. And basically, Haynes is a magazine editor editing the Constellation. So Poe's asking him to maybe write something nice about Poe's magazine, the Southern Literary Messenger, in the Constellation. And while you're at it, maybe reprint a couple of the articles from the Messengers just to let people know what a great job I'm doing. So this is more of a business letter. But Poe and Haynes had a closer friendship than that. Haynes's wife was one of Poe's childhood friends. So they had this long-time connection, and it was time for Poe to go on his honeymoon. Vegas didn't exist back then, so Poe and Sissy went down to Hiram Haynes's house in Petersburg. The building's still standing. Haynes isn't there anymore, though. But this is the letter I wanted to show you. This is a letter from Poe to Haynes from 1840. And this one, Poe starts out by apologizing for not having written back to him sooner. And then there's an interesting piece here. Apparently, Haynes has offered to give Sissy a pet fawn, a baby deer. But Poe's living in Philadelphia and Haynes still in Petersburg. So Poe has to write back to him and explain to him, having been absent from the city for a fortnight, I have only just received your kind letter of March the 24th and hasten to thank you for the star, as well as for your offer of the fawn for Mrs. P. She desires me to thank you with all her heart, but unhappily, I cannot point out a mode of conveyance. What can be done? Perhaps some opportunity may offer itself hereafter. Some friend from Petersburg may be about to pay us a visit. In the meantime, accept our best acknowledgments, precisely as if the little fellow were already nibbling the grass before our windows in Philadelphia. So it looks like Poe almost had a pet deer, but he just couldn't figure out how to transport a baby deer from Virginia all the way up to Pennsylvania. Maybe if he'd still been living in Richmond, he and Sissy would have had a pet fawn running around their yard eating the grass. But we'll never know. Maybe instead of riding the black cat, he would have ridden Bambi instead. Well, thanks for joining us this week. And if you'd like to help the Poe Museum preserve and present precious Poe pieces like these, why not become a patron and support the Poe Museum at patreon.com/Poe Museum. If you've already done that, you can help spread the word about what we're doing by liking, sharing, and subscribing. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I leave you with more gratuitous footage of Pluto the Poe Museum cat rolling around for some reason.